The Duke of Beaumont did not consider his wife a person. He considered her a solution. The problem had been a matter of lineage, of succession, and of the damnable persistence of his solicitor, Mr. Finch, whose quarterly letters had become increasingly pointed regarding the ducal responsibility to produce an heir. Alistair Beaumont, having surveyed the season's offerings with the dispassionate eye of a man inspecting livestock, had chosen Miss Elara Vance for a series of qualities she lacked. She lacked overt beauty, which would attract tiresome admirers. She lacked a powerful family, which would make demands. She lacked, it seemed, any discernible fire or spirit, which would undoubtedly prove exhausting to manage. She was, in the estimation of the Duke and his circle, a pale watercolor of a woman, pleasant enough if one happened to glance in her direction, but otherwise destined to fade into the damask wallpaper of whatever drawing room she occupied. It was this very quality, her supposed capacity for fading, that had prompted the wager. Lord Ashworth, a man whose appetites were as loud as his waistcoats, had cornered him in their club. "Beaumont, you can't be serious. The Vance girl? She's a mouse, a church mouse. Your ducal corridors will swallow her whole." Alistair had taken a slow sip of his brandy, the amber liquid, a point of warmth in the cool landscape of his indifference. He did not care for Ashworth, but he cared for the perception of his own judgment. "She is suitable," he had stated, the words clipped and final. "Suitable for a vicarage, perhaps." Ashworth had laughed, a grating sound. "Mark my words, that girl is a hothouse flower misplaced in a northern winter. She will wilt before the season ends. 100 guineas says she'll be back with her aunt in Hertfordshire, weeping into her shawls, by August." The Duke, moved by a rare and foolish flicker of pride, had not dismissed the crass proposition. Instead, he had met Ashworth's gaze with one of glacial certainty. "Done," he had said, and in that single damning word, he had sealed not only a foolish bet but the entire foundation of his marriage. Elara Vance was not to be his wife, his partner, his duchess. She was to be a test of his judgment, a living testament to his ability to select a woman who would be too timid and too unremarkable to ever cause a scene, let alone flee one. He had bet on her capacity to endure through sheer insignificance. His solicitor, Mr. Finch, had drawn up the marriage settlements with his usual dry precision. Finch was a man made of vellum and ink, his veins running with legal precedent rather than blood. He had served the Beaumont Dukes for 40 years, a creature of the estate's dusty libraries and echoing halls. He had observed the selection of the future duchess with the same emotionless scrutiny he applied to a property deed. He noted her quiet demeanor, her plain but neat penmanship on the documents, and her stillness. "An economical choice, Your Grace," Finch had commented, his highest form of praise. "There will be little fuss." Alistair had taken it as a confirmation of his excellent judgment. Fuss was precisely what he was paying, quite handsomely, to avoid. The wedding was a muted affair, appropriate for the bride's station and the groom's temperament. Elara had been a figure in ivory, her face pale and composed. She had spoken her vows in a voice so low it was nearly lost in the cavernous chapel. Alistair had performed his role with flawless, remote courtesy. He had placed the heavy Beaumont ring on her finger, his touch brief and impersonal, and had felt nothing more than the satisfactory click of a lock falling into place. The problem of the succession was, for all intents and purposes, solved. Their first weeks at Beaumont Hall were a study in polite distance. They dined together each evening at opposite ends of a mahogany table that could have seated 30. The vast space between them was filled with the silent judgment of ancestral portraits and the clinking of silver on porcelain. Alistair would inquire about her day, a perfunctory question to which he expected no substantive answer. "It was pleasant, thank you," she would reply, her voice a soft murmur. "I walked in the gardens." "Good," he would say, and then retreat into his own thoughts, considering matters of tenant disputes or investments in shipping. He saw her, but he did not notice her. She was a presence in his home, a quiet figurehead at his table, the future mother of his heir. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He failed to notice the way her eyes, A shade of gray he had once mentally catalogued as mousy, were in fact the color of a stormy sea, and how they missed nothing. She saw the subtle way the head footman deferred to the butler, indicating a hidden power struggle below stairs. She saw the faint tremor in the hand of the young maid who served the soup, a sign of fear or exhaustion. She saw the way the light hit the dust motes, dancing in the library, a room he cherished but which was being poorly kept. Her first quiet assertion of agency was so subtle he almost missed it entirely. The estate ledgers, a source of perpetual vexation for him and his overwhelmed secretary, were a disaster. For generations, the Beaumonts had relied on a convoluted system of cross-referencing and anecdotal notes. Outlasted, a man of logic, found it infuriating. He spent 2 nights a week wrestling with the tangled figures, his temper fraying. One evening, he left the main ledger open on a side table in the drawing room, having abandoned his work in disgust. He came down the next morning to find it exactly where he had left it, but tucked inside was a single sheet of foolscap. On it, in her neat, plain hand, was a simple table. She had reorganized the muddled data from the most recent quarter concerning the tenant farm's rents received, expenditures for repairs, outstanding debts. She had used a double-entry method he had only seen in modern mercantile houses in London. It was clear, concise, and devastatingly accurate. At the bottom, a small note read, "Forgive my presumption. I noticed a discrepancy in the seed accounts for the North pastures. This might clarify the matter." Outlasted stared at the sheet of paper. He felt a prickle of something he could not name. It was not annoyance, not precisely. It was recalibration. He had assumed her mind was as quiet and unfurnished as her conversation. This document suggested an interior landscape he had not bothered to map. He looked for her, intending to ask how she came by such knowledge. He found her in the neglected conservatory at the far end of the west wing, a place of dusty glass and forgotten, skeletal plants. She was standing in a patch of pale sunlight, carefully wiping the grime from the leaves of a single, struggling camellia. "The ledgers," he said, his voice sounding overloud in the quiet, glass-walled room. She turned, unsurprised. She did not startle. He was beginning to realize she never startled. "I hope I did not overstep." "Your Grace." "Where did you learn this system?" he asked, ignoring the apology. "My father was a younger son," she said simply, her gaze returning to the plant. "He took a position with a trading company to make his way. He believed a woman should understand accounts as well as she understands needlepoint. He said one was far more likely to save her from ruin than the other." There was no pride in her voice, merely the statement of a fact. Outlasted found himself at a loss. He had expected a story of a governess or a brief, fashionable education. He had not expected this glimpse of a practical, clear-eyed upbringing. He had mistaken her quietness for emptiness. The note on the ledger was not an accident. It was a demonstration. "It was helpful," he conceded, the words feeling stiff and inadequate. He laid the sheet of paper on a nearby stone bench. "You may, if you wish, you may review the others." "Thank you," she said, her attention already focused back on her task of rescuing the dying camellia. He left her there, in the forgotten conservatory, and felt the distinct and unsettling sensation that he had just been politely dismissed. The Duke of Beaumont was not accustomed to being dismissed, politely or otherwise, especially not by a woman he had mentally categorized as part of the household furnishings. This was the first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath his assumptions was not as solid as he had believed. But he was a man of immense pride and long-held habit. He filed the incident away as an anomaly, a useful anomaly. To be sure, the estate accounts became models of clarity over the next few weeks, but an anomaly nonetheless. He continued to see her as the solution to his problem, now with the added benefit of being a surprisingly competent, unpaid secretary. His perception of her had shifted from unremarkable to unremarkably useful. It was a change in category, not in essence. He still did not see her. The discovery, when it came, was as quiet and devastating as a pane of glass cracking in a frost. It happened 2 months into their marriage. Outlasted had received a letter from Lord Ashworth, a gloating, boorish inquiry about the wager. "Is the little mouse still scurrying in your wainscoting, Beaumont? or has she wilted as predicted? My man of business is prepared to collect on your 100 guineas. Alistair had read it with a surge of irritation, not for the insult to his wife, but for the insult to his judgment. Elara had not wilted. She was, if anything, proving remarkably hardy. She ran the household with an efficiency that was both invisible and absolute. Meals were on time. Staff disputes had vanished. The entire machinery of his life ran more smoothly than it ever had. She was the perfect silent cog in his world. He had won the wager, and Ashworth's letter was an annoyance to be dealt with. He had penned a short, cutting reply, enclosed a bank draft for the 100 guineas, with a note that said, "A man of honor pays his debts, even those of a fool," implying Ashworth was the fool for doubting him, and had left Ashworth's original letter on his desk, intending to burn it later. But he was called away on urgent estate business, and forgot. He was gone for 3 days. When he returned, the household was in its usual state of perfect, serene order. His dinner was served promptly. The fire in his study was lit, and on his desk his papers were neatly stacked. Ashworth's letter was there, placed squarely in the center of his blotter. He only noticed because it was not as he had left it. He was a man of precise habits. He had tossed the letter down at an angle. Now, it was perfectly aligned with the edges of the desk, and it had been folded. He remembered crumpling it slightly in his fist. The single sheet was now smooth, bearing the faint, geometric lines of having been carefully folded and then, just as carefully, unfolded and flattened once more. An icy stillness settled in the pit of his stomach. Only one person other than his valet was permitted to tidy his desk. Elara. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the great house pressing in on him. He pictured her finding the letter. He pictured her reading the callous, dismissive words, "She will wilt before the season ends." He pictured her reading Ashworth's crude reference to her as a little mouse. He pictured her seeing, in black and white, the transactional and insulting reality of her marriage. That her presence in this house, her entire life, was the subject of a gentleman's bet. He thought about her reaction. He would have expected tears, a confrontation, a dramatic, messy scene of the sort he had married her to avoid. He braced himself for it, but there was nothing. The next morning, she greeted him at the breakfast table with her usual quiet composure. "Good morning, Your Grace. I trust your journey was satisfactory." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw the true color of them. They were not mousy gray. They were the color of slate, cool and deep and unreadable. There was no accusation in them, no anger, no sorrow. There was nothing. It was a perfect, polished emptiness. A door had been closed, and he hadn't even heard the latch click. That was when the unraveling began. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing process of attrition. He started to notice things, because their absence forced him to. The first thing to go was the music. Elara often played the pianoforte in the evenings, simple, melancholic pieces that had become a background sound to his reading. He had never commented on it, had never considered it anything more than a pleasant, feminine accomplishment. 3 days after his return, he realized the drawing room was silent. The pianoforte remained closed. The silence it left behind was enormous, a hollow space in the evening air. Then, it was the flowers. Small, tasteful arrangements had begun appearing around the house. A single rose on his desk, a spray of lavender on the mantelpiece. He had not known who was responsible, assuming it was a housekeeper. Now, the vases stood empty. The room seemed duller, their colors muted. He began to notice her absence at the dinner table. She would plead a headache or claim to have already eaten on a tray in her rooms. The long, polished mahogany stretched between his solitary place setting and her empty chair, a vast and accusing wasteland. When she did appear, her conversation was a masterpiece of polite evasion. She answered his questions but never offered a thought. She listened but never spoke. She was a perfect, beautiful automaton of a duchess. The household, which had run so smoothly under her invisible command, began to show tiny signs of friction. A footman was insolent. A maid was found crying. The ledgers, which she had so brilliantly organized, were now simply maintained. They were accurate, yes, but the insightful little notes at the bottom of the pages, "The damp in the West Cottage requires urgent attention," or, "I suggest we purchase seed from this supplier instead." Their quality was superior last season, had vanished. She was performing her duties, but she was no longer invested in them. She was doing what was required, and not an ounce more. He was living with the ghost of his wife. He found himself watching her. He studied her across the dinner table on the rare occasions she joined him. He observed her as she walked in the gardens, her posture erect, her expression serene and distant. He was searching for a crack in the facade, a flicker of anger, a hint of pain. He found nothing but a profound, unbreachable calm. It was the calm of a country after a war, a landscape scoured of all feeling. She had not wilted. She had petrified. The realization of his own monstrous folly did not arrive in a single blinding flash. It was an accumulation, a death by 1,000 cuts of observation. He thought about the wager. She will wilt before the season ends. He had bet on her weakness, on her supposed lack of spirit. He had been so profoundly, arrogantly wrong. She had not wilted. She had not fled. She had not wept. She had read the evidence of his contempt, of his utter disregard for her as a human being, and she had responded not with feminine hysterics, but with a strategy of terrifying precision. She had withdrawn. She had simply, quietly, and completely removed her true self from his life, leaving behind only the shell of a duchess. She had fulfilled her side of the bargain. She was his wife. She ran his home, but she had rescinded the unwritten contract of human connection. He had wagered on her being a hothouse flower, and had discovered, too late, that she was a desert bloom, capable of surviving on nothing, hoarding her resources deep within, where no one could reach them. The catalyst for his epiphany came from the driest possible source, Mr. Finch. The solicitor came to Beaumont Hall to review the quarterly accounts. He sat with Alistair in the library, the newly organized ledgers laid out between them. Finch peered at the columns of figures through his spectacles. "Impeccable," he murmured. "The Duchess has a remarkable mind for figures. A credit to the estate." Alistair said nothing, a knot tightening in his chest. Finch looked up, his old shrewd eyes fixing on the Duke. "She is, however, economical with her presence of late." It was a simple statement of fact, delivered in Finch's toneless voice, but it landed like a judge's sentence. "She has been indisposed," Alistair said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Finch gave a small, dry cough that was the solicitor's equivalent of a cynical laugh. "Indeed. A great many things on this estate have become indisposed. The tenant school lacks a patroness for its festival, for the first time in 50 years. The vicar's wife complains the Duchess no longer assists with the parish poor. The conservatory roof is leaking, and no one has seen fit to report it." He paused, tapping a long, bony finger on the ledger. "The mechanics of the estate are sound. The spirit, however, seems to have taken a leave of absence." He did not mention the wager. He did not have to. Finch, Alistair realized with a sickening certainty, knew everything. He saw everything. And in his detached, legalistic way, he was passing judgment. The Duke had made a poor bargain. He had secured the title of Duchess, but had forfeited the woman herself. After Finch departed, leaving a faint scent of dust and disapproval in his wake, Alistair went looking for her. The silence of the house felt accusatory. He walked through rooms that were clean, orderly, and lifeless. They were a reflection of his marriage. A perfect, hollow arrangement. He found her where he should have known she would be. In the conservatory. It was a ruin. The leaky roof Finch had mentioned had allowed rain to drip onto the flagstones, creating slick patches of green algae. Most of the plants were dead or dying, their brown leaves littering the floor. But in the center of the decay, one spot was thriving. The camellia bush she had been tending to months ago was now flourishing. It was covered in waxy, dark green leaves and a profusion of perfect white blossoms. She had focused all her care, all her attention, on this one living thing. She was standing before it, not tending to it, but simply looking. She did not turn when he entered. He had the sense she had been aware of his approach for some time. "Ilara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without a title attached. It felt foreign and momentous on his tongue. She remained still, her back to him. "Your Grace." Her voice was perfectly level. He walked slowly toward her, the sound of his boots on the stone floor echoing in the glass house. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze falling on the thriving plant, and then on the desolation surrounding it. The metaphor was so brutal, so precise, it took his breath away. This was what she had done. She had retreated into a small, protected part of herself and let the rest of the world fall to ruin. "I was wrong," he said. The words were stark, stripped of all ducal arrogance. They were the truest words he had spoken in years. She finally turned to face him. Her expression was unchanged. That placid, unreadable calm was still in place, a shield of ice. "About what, precisely, were you wrong? Your choice of investments, the rotation of your crops, your selection of a broodmare?" The cut was so clean, so deep, he almost flinched. The wit was like a hidden blade, and he had never suspected she possessed one. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. "About you," he said, his voice raw. "I was wrong about you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Ashworth's letter. He did not offer it to her. He held it up. This, the wager. It was the act of a fool, an arrogant, blind fool. A flicker of something, not pain, but a kind of weary acknowledgement passed through her eyes. "I see. You are upset that you have been revealed to be a fool." "No," he said, crushing the letter in his fist. "I am shattered that I was one." He took a step closer. "I did not see you, Alara. I looked at you, and I saw a solution, a convenience, a quiet piece to fit into the puzzle of my life. I never once thought to look at the woman herself. I saw your stillness and called it timidity. I saw your silence and called it dullness. I saw your composure and called it weakness." He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. "I was blind. I made a bet based on my own ignorance, a vulgar, cruel bet. And my punishment is that you have given me exactly what I thought I wanted. A duchess who is perfect in her duties and utterly absent in her spirit. A wife who is a stranger in my house." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He saw the intelligence in her clear, steady gaze. He saw the strength in the fine line of her jaw. He saw the profound resilience that had allowed her to withstand his casual cruelty, not by breaking, but by sealing herself away. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I have not earned it. I may never earn it. I am here to confess my sin, not against the Duchess of Beaumont, but against Alara Vance, the woman with the mind for figures who learned from her father, the woman who plays the pianoforte when she believes no one is listening, the woman who can make a single flower bloom in a wasteland." For the first time since that terrible day, the mask of her composure cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It was a testament, a crack in the ice. "What do you want, Alistair?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The use of his name was as shocking as his own had been. "I want to tear down the rest of this ruin," he said, gesturing to the dead plants and the leaking roof. "And I want to help you cultivate a garden. I want a chance to see the woman I married, a chance to introduce myself to my own wife." She did not answer immediately. She turned her gaze back to the camellia, its white blossoms a stark declaration of life against the surrounding decay. He waited. He would have waited forever. He had spent 2 months in a silent, orderly hell of his own making, and he would spend 1,000 years there if that's what it took. The power had shifted. He had held all of it, and had squandered it on a bet. Now she held the single, most important thing, the key to the door she had closed. Finally, she spoke, her voice still quiet, but with a new note of iron beneath it. "The roof leaks, Your Grace. A garden cannot grow without a sound roof. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. It was a condition, a starting point. It was a test. A slow smile, the first genuine smile he had felt in months, touched Alistair's lips. Then we shall begin with the roof. The next day, workmen arrived at the conservatory. Alistair was there himself, not merely observing, but directing them. His ducal authority now focused on the singular task of mending what was broken. He did not ask for Alara's help. He simply began the work and trusted she was watching. She was. From the window of her sitting room, she watched him. He was not dressed in his usual immaculate riding clothes, but in his shirt sleeves, pointing out warped panes of glass and rotten timbers to the foreman. He was engaged. He was present. That evening, at dinner, he did not sit at the far end of the table. He had a footman move his place setting to the seat directly beside hers. The proximity was startling, a breach of the cold protocol they had established. "The glaziers believe they can salvage most of the original glass," he said, his voice low, intended only for her. "They say it is of a remarkable quality." "It is," she replied, her own voice quiet. "It was imported from Venice by your great-grandmother. She was a keen botanist." He looked surprised, then intrigued. "How did you know that?" "I read her journals. They are in the back of the library, in a rosewood box." He had lived in this house his entire life and had never known. He had walked past that box 1,000 times and never once wondered what was inside. She had been here for mere months and had already uncovered the house's secrets, its history, its soul. This became their new pattern. He would undertake a task, the restoration of the conservatory, the repair of the tenant schoolhouse roof, the restocking of the library's shelves, and she would watch. And in the evenings, he would report his progress, and she would, in her quiet way, reveal some piece of knowledge she possessed, a small, precious jewel of information she had gathered during her silent observations. She was teaching him about his own home, his own history, his own life. She was teaching him how to see. He took a decisive, public step of atonement a month later. He attended a large ball in London, ensuring that Lord Ashworth would be present. He found the man holding court near the card rooms, his face flushed with wine. Alistair approached, his presence casting a sudden chill over the group. He held out a fat purse that clinked heavily. "Ashworth," he said, his voice clear and carrying. "I believe I owe you for a wager we made at the beginning of the season." Ashworth beamed, his ego swelling. "Beaumont, I knew you were a man of honor." "So the little mouse finally packed her bags, did she?" Alistair's smile was thin and dangerous. "On the contrary, it seems I misunderstood the terms of our bet. I wagered that my wife would endure the season. You wagered she would wilt. You see, I thought we were betting on her fortitude. I have since come to realize we were, in fact, betting on my intelligence." He tossed the purse onto the card table. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud that silenced all conversation. "I lost. My intelligence was sorely, laughably lacking. I failed to recognize that I was marrying the most resilient, intelligent, and remarkable woman in all of London. A woman of such profound worth that to speak of her in the same breath as a grubby financial wager is a sacrilege. So, I am paying my debt, as a fool must. But know this, any man who ever again speaks of my wife, the Duchess of Beaumont, with anything less than the utmost reverence, will answer to me directly." He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving Ashworth standing amidst a sea of shocked and silent faces, his reputation shredded more effectively than any duel could have accomplished. When Alistair returned to Beaumont Hall, he did not tell Alara what he had done, but news traveled. A week later, he found a single, perfect white camellia laid on his pillow. The rebuilding was a slow, quiet process. It was a thing of shared glances over architectural plans for the new conservatory. It was the sound of her pianoforte beginning to drift through the house again, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. It was him asking for her opinion on an investment, and truly listening to her shrewd, well-reasoned answer. It was her, placing a hand on his arm to point out a rare bird in the garden, a simple, unconscious gesture that made his heart stop. He learned about her. He learned she had a dry, sharp wit that she had kept hidden like a pearl in an oyster. He learned she loved poetry, but only the fierce, passionate kind. He learned she had a deep and abiding sense of justice that manifested in her tireless, secret work to improve the lives of his tenants. He learned that her stillness was not emptiness, but a deep well of observation and thought. He was a man discovering a new continent, one he had owned for months but had never bothered to explore. The love that grew between them was not a sudden fire, but a slow, deep-rooted planting. It was nurtured by attention, by respect, by the mutual act of seeing and being seen. The external conflict with Ashworth resolved itself with a whimper. The man, ostracized and humiliated, attempted to spread a vicious rumor about Alara's family, but he found no purchase. The Duke and Duchess of Beaumont now presented a united, formidable front. They appeared in society together, not as a remote duke and his quiet wife, but as a partnership. There was a warmth between them, a current of unspoken understanding that everyone could see. Alistair's public defense of her had been so absolute that any attack on her now was seen as an attack on him, and no one was foolish enough to challenge the Duke of Beaumont. Ashworth faded into obscurity, a relic of a past Alistair had fully rejected. 1 year after their muted wedding, the conservatory was reborn. It was a palace of glass and light, filled with thriving, exotic plants from all over the world. In the center, pride of place was given to a single, magnificent camellia bush, heavy with white blooms. Alistair stood with Alara in the warm, humid air, the scent of jasmine and damp earth around them. She was no longer pale. A healthy color bloomed in her cheeks. Her gray eyes were no longer guarded, but clear and bright. She was expecting their first child in the spring. "It's beautiful, Alistair," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "You are beautiful," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer feared. "I almost missed it. I almost lived my whole life in a silent, empty house, never knowing." She smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit her entire face. "But you learned to see. You taught me," he corrected. Their new harmony was a quiet thing, but it was as strong and real as the ancient stones of the hall. It was built not on a contract or a wager, but on a foundation of hard-won understanding. It was present in the shared laughter over the breakfast table, in the comfortable silence as they read by the fire, in the way his hand always found hers as they walked through the gardens. Another year passed. The nursery was no longer silent. It was filled with the cries and gurgles of a healthy baby boy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's stormy, observant eyes. The final piece of the old world fell away on a crisp autumn afternoon. Mr. Finch had announced his retirement. He was old, frail, his body finally succumbing to the decades he had spent hunched over legal documents. He had come to Beaumont Hall to take his final leave of the Duke and Duchess. Alistair and Alara walked with him to his waiting carriage. The old solicitor, who had seen dukes come and go, looked from Alistair to Alara, and then to the thriving estate around them. The gardens were immaculate, the tenant houses freshly painted, the sound of children's laughter coming from the direction of the newly expanded school. "Your Grace," Finch said to Alistair, but his eyes were on Alara. "The Beaumont estate has never been in better order, a testament to sound management." Alistair placed a hand on his wife's back. "It is a testament to my Duchess." Finch gave a rare, thin smile. It was a smile of profound satisfaction, the expression of a man who has seen a complex, long-term case finally settle in favor of justice. He bowed stiffly to Alara. "Your Grace, it has been an honor." She inclined her head, her grace and composure absolute. She was no longer the fading watercolor he had first met. She was a masterpiece in full, vibrant color, the mistress of her home, the center of her husband's world. As the carriage pulled away, Alistair looked at his wife. The woman Lord Ashworth had bet would wilt before the season's end. The woman his own foolish pride had nearly destroyed. She had not wilted. She had endured the winter of his indifference, survived the drought of his neglect, and had bloomed in the eventual brilliant sunlight of his love. She had outlasted the wager. She had outlasted the insult, and now, today, she had officially outlasted his solicitor. She had outlasted the entire transactional world that had sought to define her, and had built a new one on her own quiet, unshakable terms. He drew her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. The past was a ghost, a story they would one day tell their children, a cautionary tale about the folly of not seeing what is right in front of you. But the present and the future was this warmth, this peace, this quiet, extraordinary love. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. It's a tale about the quiet power of attention, and how sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about grand gestures, but about the slow, steady process of truly learning to see another person. Tell me in the comments, if you were Alara, what one condition would you have added for Alistair to prove he had truly changed? Like and subscribe for more stories. Our next tale is one of secrets and shadows. A governess with a hidden past, a widowed earl who has locked away his heart, and a dusty, forgotten nursery at the top of a crumbling manor. They arrive here, in this small corner of the world, whenever they are ready.